When did your boss nearly end someone's life? I was cleaning up after my daycare snack time when I noticed 3-year-old Eloise scratching at her neck and wheezing in the corner by the blocks. I ran to the owner, Mrs. Henderson, to tell her Eloise was having an allergic reaction. Henderson barely looked and said Eloise was just being dramatic because her mother coddles her too much. She said if I kept overreacting to every child's tantrum, I wouldn't last long in childcare. 5 minutes later, Eloise was gasping like she was breathing through a straw and her eyes were swollen shut. I begged Henderson to let me call Eloise's mom or at least check her file for allergies, but Henderson stood up and got in my face. She said if I made one phone call or disturbed one parent over a child's attention-seeking behavior, she'd not only fire me but make sure I never worked with children again by reporting me for causing unnecessary panic. That's when Eloise collapsed onto the reading mat and started making these tiny choking sounds that I'll never forget as long as I live. Her fingernails were turning blue and she was clawing at her throat like she was trying to rip it open to get air, and the other kids started screaming because they knew something was seriously wrong. I ran to the medical cabinet where we kept the EpiPens, but Henderson blocked me with her body and said I was not authorized to give any medications without written parental consent on file. I shoved past her and grabbed the pediatric EpiPen while she screamed that she was calling the police to have me arrested for assault and practicing medicine without a license. Eloise's whole face was swollen like a balloon and her lips were purple, and when I knelt beside her she wasn't even crying anymore because she didn't have enough air to make sounds. Henderson was on the phone with her lawyer screaming about liability and lawsuits while this tiny 3-year-old was dying on our classroom floor, and she kept saying Eloise was just holding her breath to manipulate us. I ripped open the EpiPen package with shaking hands while Henderson threatened to destroy my entire life if I touched that child with that needle. The other assistant was crying and begging me not to do it because Henderson would ruin both of us, but all I could see was Eloise's face turning from blue to gray. Henderson grabbed my wrist and tried to wrestle the EpiPen away from me, screaming that she'd been running this daycare for 20 years and knew a faker when she saw one. I shoved her off and she fell backward into the toy shelf, and that's when she really lost it, shrieking about assault charges and how I'd go to prison. The room smelled like urine because Eloise had wet herself, and her little chest was barely moving anymore, just these tiny, shallow gasps that were getting further apart. I pulled the blue safety cap off the EpiPen, and Henderson screamed that if that child died from that injection, I'd be charged with murder, but if I put it down right now, she'd only fire me. The other kids were huddled in the corner crying, and one boy kept asking if Eloise was going to die while Henderson yelled at him to shut up and sit down. I positioned the orange tip against Eloise's thigh like I'd been trained, and Henderson was standing over me screaming that she was calling 911 to report an assault in progress by a rogue employee. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the pen steady, and I kept thinking about how Eloise's mom dropped her off that morning and said she'd been so excited about show and tell today. Henderson was filming me with her phone saying she needed evidence for the police and her insurance company, and she kept repeating that when this was over, I'd never work anywhere again. I looked at Eloise's face one more time, and her eyes had rolled back and she wasn't moving at all, just this horrible rattling sound coming from her throat. I pressed the EpiPen against her thigh and pushed until I heard the click, holding it there while counting to 10 like the training said, and Henderson let out this scream like I'd stabbed her instead of Eloise. She was calling me a criminal and a child abuser and saying I'd just killed this child with my paranoia and incompetence, that Eloise was allergic to the medication, and I'd sent her into cardiac arrest. The medicine went in, and I pulled the pen out, and Eloise just lay there completely still and gray, while Henderson stood over us ranting about prison sentences and medical battery, and how she had it all on video. I put my fingers on Eloise's neck trying to feel a pulse, but my hands were shaking too much, and her skin felt cold and wrong, and all I could think was what if Henderson was right and I'd just killed this baby with my need to play hero. Full story on the channel below.